In the first two videos in this series, we looked at 4 pieces of evidence for God as Trinity. So I'm going to review them in the beginning of this video. The first piece of evidence was Echad from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4, which points to a composite oneness in God. The other word in the Old Testament for one is Yahid, and it never means composite oneness. Yes, it is true that at times Echad does mean just one, but many other times in the Old Testament, the context clearly shows that Echad means composite oneness. Here are some of the many verses where we see this. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. Genesis chapter 11 and verse 6. Genesis chapter 34 and verse 16 and 22. Exodus chapter 24 and verse 3. Judges chapter 20, verses 8 and 11. 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 25. 1 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 38. Ezra chapter 3 and verse 1. Ezekiel chapter 37 and verse 17 and 22. I would encourage anyone watching this video to pause, write down all of these references, and look them up for yourselves so you see that I am not making this up. So those who claim that Echad never means composite oneness in the Old Testament are simply being dishonest with the evidence that is there in the Old Testament. They are either dishonest or they are being deceived. Those are the only two options. And again, my question is, why did God use Echad and not Yahid if he is not triune? All God had to do was use Yahid in that one verse in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4, and the door would have shut forever on the doctrine of God as Trinity. So, piece of evidence number 1, Echad points to a composite oneness in God. Number 2, multiple times in the Old Testament, God uses plural pronouns for himself, like Genesis 1:26. Number 3, Elohim is a name for God that is plural, and it is found over 2,500 times in the Old Testament. And number 4, Psalm 110 and verse 1, in that psalm, in that verse, you have 2 divine persons. There David says, Yahweh says to Adonai, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And then in 3 of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, Jesus quotes from this verse in Psalm 110 to show that he is the Adonai spoken of by David. How can there be 2 divine persons when God says he is one? At that point, you have a choice. Either there are 2 gods, or there is more than one person in the being of God. And that idea goes along very well with what we are already seeing in Echad, in Elohim, and with the plural pronouns that God uses of himself. Now, with those 4 pieces of evidence under our belt, in this video, what I want to do is I want to look at a 5th piece of evidence, which has to do with a very unique angel of the Old Testament that is repeatedly referred to as the angel of the Lord. There are many angels seen in the Bible, and they do all sorts of things on behalf of God. But there is one angel that stands out as unique because he talks like God and acts like God. This angel does things that only God has the right to do in the Bible. And this angel is known in the Old Testament as the angel of the Lord. Now, before we look at just some of the Old Testament passages where we find this angel, it is important to note that the word angel means messenger. The word angel basically means messenger in the Bible. The word basically bespeaks of the role of a messenger. Whether you look it up in the Hebrew Old Testament and find the word malach, or the New Testament and find the Greek word angelos, the meaning for both is the same. An angel is one who is sent. It is a messenger. This is very important to note because anyone could easily make the mistake in thinking that the word angel only refers to spiritual beings who are created by God. The word angel is even used at times in the Bible to refer to human beings. Here are some examples. From the Old Testament, in Genesis chapter 32 and verse 3, we read, "And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau." The word there for messengers is malachim, which is a plural form of malach, which is the word for angel. We find the same word, malachim, used of people in 1 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 3. In the New Testament, in Luke chapter 7 and verse 24, messengers from John are referred to as angelon, which is a plural form of angelos, which means angel, messenger. We find the same thing in James chapter 2 and verse 25. Human beings referred to as angels because they functioned in the role of messengers. So, any verse or verses in the Bible that tell us about an angel need the surrounding context to determine whether or not they are speaking of spiritual beings or human beings or something even greater like this angel of the Lord. Angel means messenger. Remember that. Now, there are many Old Testament passages where we see this angel of the Lord, and quite frankly, I do not have the time to cover them in a limited YouTube video. I have limited equipment, and I have limited time as a full-time pastor. But for those who are interested in further study, I can recommend some passages for you to look up that have to do with the angel of the Lord. These are not all of the passages, they're just some, but there are some very important passages where we see the angel of the Lord. Genesis chapter 16, verses 9 through 14. Genesis 21, verses 16 through 20. Genesis 22, verses 11 through 18. Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. Or Judges chapter 6, verses 11 through 24. And there are many more such passages. Just do a Google search on the angel of the Lord, and you will find out where they are. For our purpose in this video, I only want to briefly look at two passages where we find the angel of the Lord. Two passages that I believe are very, very important. The first is Exodus chapter 3 and verses 1 through 6. Here are the key points from this passage. Number 1, the angel of the Lord is in the midst of the burning bush that Moses turns aside to look at. That's Exodus chapter 3 and verse 2. Secondly, God calls to Moses from the midst of the burning bush. Exodus 3 and verse 4. Thirdly, what God says to Moses is that he needs to remove his sandals because he is standing on holy ground by going near to the burning bush. That's Exodus 3 and verse 5. And the context shows that this is because God's presence is in the bush. The reason why Moses is supposed to remove his shoes because he's standing on holy ground is because of the very presence of the Lord in the bush. Fourthly, in 3:6, Exodus 3:6, God tells Moses that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the verse ends with this, quote, "Then Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God," end quote. At this point, with Moses' face in the dirt, in worship of the Lord, if this angel, if this messenger was not divine, then surely he would have told Moses to not worship him, which is what angels do elsewhere in the Bible. But instead, this angel of the Lord not only doesn't tell Moses to not worship him by prostrating himself on the ground, but in Exodus 3:7, the Lord speaks to Moses again, telling Moses that he has seen the suffering of his people in Egypt, and that ends up being the reason why God chooses Moses to go to Egypt to liberate the Israelites. So, summary here is in Exodus 3, 1 through 6, we see the angel of the Lord and the Lord and God all used interchangeably for the same God. And that forces you to ask the questions of, how can an angel of the Lord be God? Or even greater, how can a mere angel of the Lord receive worship? Next, we turn to Judges chapter 13. I'm going to focus on verses 1 through 23. In this chapter, we see the details that precede the birth of Samson. His father is a man named Manoah, and we aren't actually given his mother's name. But we are told that the wife, or his mother, before Samson is born and conceived and born, she's barren. And so an angel of the Lord appears to this woman and tells her that she's going to have a son who will be a Nazirite from the womb. And he's going to be the next deliverer of Israel. This is in Judges 13, 3 through 5. So Manoah's wife runs to her husband and tells him what she just saw and what she was just told in verses 6 and 7. And Manoah kind of feels left out and wants the angel to come back. And so he prays and asks God to send him back in verse 8 of chapter 13. God sends the angel back, and this time Manoah's wife runs and gets him. That's verses 9 and 10. Manoah asks the angel when they will have a son and what his vocation will be. That's verses 11 and 12. Next, the angel of the Lord repeats the instructions that he formerly gave to Manoah's wife in verses 13 and 14. And what happens next in verses 15 through 23 is truly amazing. Manoah actually wants to make a meal for this angel of the Lord, but the angel of the Lord basically tells him, if you make me a meal, I'm not going to eat it. You might as well just offer up a burnt offering to the Lord. So that's what Manoah sets out to do. In the meantime, Manoah asks for this angel's name. And listen to how the angel responds. The angel responds by saying, "Why do you ask for my name, seeing that it is incomprehensible?" Where else in the Bible do you find an angel telling people that his name is incomprehensible, meaning it can't be understood? Next, they offer up the burnt offering, and this angel of the Lord ascends in the flames. And it causes Manoah and his wife to fall on their faces on the ground. And when it was over, Manoah says to his wife, "We will surely die, because we have seen God." But Manoah's wife, thinking logically actually, tells him that if God had wanted to kill them, then he would not have accepted their burnt offering. Now, there is no doubt here that this is more than an angel. He tells them his name is too great for them to comprehend or understand. And when he ascends in the flame of the fire of the burnt offering, they fall on their faces in fear and worship. This is an angel of the Lord, a messenger of the Lord, and yet it is also the Lord. Now, some will say, but how can this be? But I think the better question by now, after all the evidence we've looked at, is how can this not be if God is one, yet composite, and uses plural pronouns of himself, and has names that are plural, and promises Adonai that he will sit at his right hand until his enemies are conquered? The evidence is all over the place in the Old Testament that a Unitarian monotheism is simply not in keeping with the evidence for God in the Bible. At this point, with what we've looked at, we are talking about at least two persons within the being of God. All this evidence is pointing towards at least two persons within the being of God. And guess what the Bible says of Jesus, about Jesus in John 1:18? It says there, "No one has seen God at any time," which must include the Old Testament and these appearances that we've just talked about. "No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him," or revealed him, or could be translated exegeted him. It's talking about Jesus. John 1:18 is about Jesus. The evidence points toward Christ being this angel of the Lord, who is at the same time the Lord. All these Old Testament appearances of the Lord, where people saw God, it was not the Father, but rather it was an Old Testament pre-incarnate Christ. We are talking about Old Testament pre-incarnate appearances of Christ, who is just as much God as the Father. So my conclusion thus far, based upon the 5 pieces of evidence that we've looked at, is that the Old Testament leads me to conclude so far that there are at least 2 persons within the being of God. But as we're going to see, there is also another person that is revealed in the Old Testament. And we will begin to look at that in the next video.